Okay, that's cool.
The last time I did this, I saw his recording and I assumed mine was recording. So I just have
Oh
to be very
no.
mindful of me recording. I said,
and
oh,
you didn't
I'm gonna
get
need a
nothing,
paper
huh?
play. I'm gonna need you to send me that audio back.
Right.
It was so embarrassing.
No, it
But here
happens.
we go. I'll go ahead and record. I just edit after the fact.
No problem.
Record to the cloud. All right. So I guess it's recording twice. It doesn't say that. So I got your talking points. You're just gonna open it up. So you're just gonna be the main talk. I don't like to talk. I don't like to talk that much. I just like to say whatever key point to keep it moving. I really just like the person to have the floor to open up and do their thing. You know what I'm saying?
Okay.
So I'll probably open up with, let's see, what would be a good opener up and saying, of course, I introduce you, and then we'll just talk about. We'll probably just bring it back before your talking points about like your upbringing, and then tell how to transition into you becoming a military, an army. That's army, right? SFC.
Yes. Yeah.
An army, because I know like for my story, what transitioned to me was basically escape from gang activity. So everybody has a story about what helped them. Some people wanted to do it for education, etc. And then we can talk about your accolades from there, if that's okay.
Cool deal.
All right. So I'm gonna start my recording again. And then I restart it because that's how I do. I cheat. I don't like to edit as much. I try to edit as less as I can.
Wait, how are you gonna stop yours?
Because it's a cleaner edit. And welcome to another episode of More Than Therapy. Today we speak with Mr. Farron Dozier, a retired military veteran who gave us 24 years of his life in the Army. In my opinion, one of the hardest services to do duty to this country, which oftentimes does not love us back, but that's just my accolade, that's my story. Mr. Dozier, tell me about what your upbringing, how'd you transition to being the man you are today? What was the roots that caused this to occur?
Thank you for having me today to be a part of this conversation. I'm really blessed to share my story. I grew up 70s kid, 1970. Parents weren't married, so you know how the 70s were. So grew up with my parents separately. So my dad would pick me up, hang out with him, spend time with my mom. I actually grew up with my grandparents from 72 to 78 because my mom was working. And so my grandparents suggested that instead of her driving me every morning for them to babysit me, they agreed to just let me stay there while she worked and got her things together. And she would pick me up on the weekends. Whatever.
It was on the wrong device, ran out of space.
Okay.
I'm gonna have to record to the cloud.
Don't worry about it. We're gonna miss.
Hello, and welcome to another episode of More Than Therapy. Today we have Mr. Farron Dozier, a retired Army veteran who gave us 24 years of his life. Thank you, sir, for your service. Mr. Dozier.
Yes.
Tell me about your upbringing. What had you transition to becoming this military soldier, and then the things that you did even after the fact of your military career?
So thank you for having me today. Definitely been an honor to be on your show and share my story, testimony, and give some insights. So I joined the military. My uncle was in the Air Force, and he was asking me around, I was like 17, and he was like, well, what are you gonna do, when you get out of high school? And I was like, you know what, man, I'm not sure. I want to buy a car. I know that much. And so he was like, okay, well, and I knew he was in the Air Force Reserve and he was doing pretty well at it. And so he suggested that I give it a try. And I'm like, I'm not really interested, but I have friends in ROTC and, in junior high school and high school. And so I, play with Army men and stuff like that as a kid, but never really had any urge to join the service. But when he introduced it to me, I was like, I'll take a look at it. And so his advice was go part-time first, because if you don't like it and you go full-time first, then you're going to be stuck in that contract of 3 to 4 years. So he suggested that I go part-time first. If I like the part-time, then I could always transfer and go active duty full-time. So I was like, okay. So I initially took the test for the Air Force. And for whatever reason that I'll share later, they said that I could join another branch, but not the Air Force branch. So I was like, okay, a little bit disappointed. So I'll go home And a few hours later, National Guard recruiter calls and he wants to come over and sit down and talk to me. So I invited him to my grandparents' house, and he offers me this bonus, signing bonus, and talks about the National Guard, and we stateside and we do all the work in case of state emergencies and things like that. So I was 19 years old, and I was like, you know what, that sounds pretty good. I get a bonus, so why not? And so I signed up part time, did the National Guard thing, and then a couple of years into it, like I was like, you know what, I think I like this. Like I think this is something that I could get into. So I started looking into going active duty. And then I had an opportunity to become AGR, which was Active Guard Reserve, but your full-time status for the state. And so I became a supply sergeant, active duty AGR, and as an E4. And that set the tone for my active duty career for the 20 years. So I have a total of 24 years of service because they count the part-time 4 years of the National Guard.
Indeed, indeed. Thank you for your service. I myself was in the military. I was in the United States Navy Submarine Division and didn't do nearly as much time as you did. Woo. Thank you for your service.
Yeah, thank you.
But I found that I had a lot of mental health woes associated with my time in the service. One, on submarines, you're underwater for 6 months, so you're separated from the sun. So that can, for those that might be sensitive to it, they may get a condition called seasonal affective disorder because they don't have sun, they don't see the up and down, they become all discombobulated. But then not even that, just a lot of sexual travesties happen, not from observations or even from experience. So even when I was actually honorably discharged on a mental health condition because of some of the things that happened to me in the military. You are a veteran suicide awareness. Tell me about your experience regarding you helping veterans get through these hard times in their lives in which they feel like it's, even though they gave so much to protect the people of this country, gave so much in order to be an advocate for them and be the strength that that country needed in order for them to continue their way of life, when they said that their life was not even worth living anymore. Tell me about your work with that population of those soldiers, of those people that are going through hell and then oftentimes don't get the help they need to get through that storm, even though they gave so much to help America get through its storm.
Definitely. And so let me paint the context for you, because I had to do the experience it myself before I could even get to the point where I'm able to even articulate it and help and be able to listen to other veterans of our community. And so I had a great career. I did my time. I served. We trained our soldiers and Iraqi soldiers together during 2004-05 when they were doing the car bombings and attacking the convoys with the supplies and the mechanics. So they brought us in to train units that were going to go overseas. And so I did that as my contribution. And then I got done with that. I made E7 during that time. And then so I transferred to my next duty station. And then I transferred back to California. And I was able to get enrolled in the Master Sergeant Academy, which was for my E8. And so by this time, it was my 17th year. Like I said, I had a great career, no real problems. And I go to this camp, I go to the school, and I'm doing the Army physical fitness test. I get up that morning, I do the push-ups, sit-ups, and I'm out doing the 2-mile run. And so we're trained to sprint that last lap. So as I heard the instructor, as I turned the corner, 15:45, 15:46, and I'm like, oh man, I'm doing pretty good. I'm 36 years old at the time. I had like 17:21 to pass the run, and I'm at 15:45, almost 16 minutes. So like I said, we're trained to sprint that last lap. So I take off, and I did feel like this electrical charge like come over my body, but I didn't think anything of it. So across the finish line, 16 minutes, hand over my head, get air in my, in my lungs and all that stuff we're trained to do. But all of a sudden my peripheral started getting dark. I'm like, man, I don't feel well. And I started feeling nauseated. And so I closed my eyes, I laid down. I didn't pass out, but when I opened my eyes, everything was spinning like 1,000,000 miles an hour. And so the medics came and got me, rushed me to the hospital. I'm in there in the bed, and the doctor comes in with an IV. I don't know how much later he comes back and says, hey, you ever had kidney problems? I says, no. He says, what do you do now? And then he walks out. And my instructor, we're looking at each other like, what is going on? So he comes back in and says, you know what, freak accident. You probably just dehydrated. heat stroke. I'm gonna give you one more IV, go back to the barracks and get some rest. You should be fine. So I'm like, okay, so take the rest of the day off. I wake up and I'm worse. Everything is still spinning. I'm throwing up. I'm in a bad state, barely made it to the bathroom, like really in a terrible state. So I go back to sleep. I wake up and I know it's 4:30 because my classmates come back in the barracks and they rush me back to the hospital. So the night doctor does some tests and he sees that my CK levels, my creatinine kinase levels are like 12,000 and rising. And at my age of 36, they're supposed to be like 150. And so what was happening was I have developed a condition called rhabdomyolysis, which is a skeletal muscular disorder. So the morning doctor did see the renal failure, but didn't pay attention or what, but I was having renal failure and my kidneys were failing at about 50% each when I went to the doctor that night. And so what the doctor did was he just put me on IVs for 4 days and that ended up flushing my kidneys. I had very severe skeletal muscular damage, joint damage, vertigo, a lot of secondary health complications during that time. And so after I was able to, my family come and get me from school, I went back home and started going to my regular doctor to make sure what was, to find out what happened to me. And so they send me to the specialist and he's, checking me out and testing my blood and making sure everything is fine. But every time I go to try to get back to or start exercising, it feel like I got off a roller coaster. Like I was just kind of groggy and I was just kind of out of it. And so for 2.5 years, that was what I was doing, kind of exercising my own pace, but then trying to get back in, so I can go to school. And he just agreed and we agreed that I couldn't run anymore. So I'm like, okay, that's cool. Like I've seen worse. So I could do the bicycle or I could do the walk. The myth is real. I don't swim. So I was like, I'm not doing a swim, so I'm like, I could do alternate events. And so we took that paperwork and we turned it in to the state surgeons. And when they got a hold of it, they flagged me and it's like, no, you can't do anything. You can't exercise anymore until we find out what's going on with you. And I'm like, look, this is like, that's like almost 3 years later, like everything's fine. I just, I could do the walk. And so they said no, and they flagged me. And I had got this email because I was in charge of the unit. So the email came in after we did all those physicals. And so of course I go look at what's next to my name. And next to my name, it said pending discharge. And I'm like, wait, what? Like, no, like, how am I getting discharged? Nobody's talked to me. And so I called the office and the lady's like, oh, it's a mistake. It shouldn't say that. You have to go through a medical board and then the medical board will determine if you could stay in or not. And I'm like, okay, cool. But when I played that back, I realized that I made that email mean that my life was over when I read pending discharge. So imagine I'm at work from that point on, and every time the phone rang, it was like, is this the phone call that's going to end my career? And so that kind of spun me into this depression of worrying about, my life is over. And sure enough, they found me not fit for service. It took them 3 years to medical retire me by the time they got all the paperwork together. By this time, life was over. Like I was just ready to just drive my car off the freeway. Like it was done. Like, and now when I look back at it, it was my identity. And we'll talk about the identity crisis that happens to some of us inside that camouflage uniform, right? And so during that time from 2006 to 2010, I'm going to therapy. I could barely walk. And I passed the officer who was my platoon leader during the war. We served together. We ran the platoon together and I hadn't seen him for 5 years. And so we passed each other and he's like, how you been? And I'm like, man, you don't want to know. He's like, no, tell me. I said, man, I can barely walk. My muscles aching. I'm going to mental health appointments, man. I'm just, that's over. And he was like, you know what? Something like that happened to me before where my muscles locked up, but I have sickle cell trait. So I have to drink extra water, take these vitamins. And I'm like, man, why does that sound familiar? And then I remember my physical from 1999. I was transferring to Michigan to be a supply sergeant for an infantry company. And the LA Air Force Base did my blood work and they called me in a panic, like, you need to come back to the clinic like today. And so I'm like, okay, cool. So I drive over like, hey, what's going on? Like, I got something. And they're like, do you know you have sickle cell trait? I'm like, no. It's okay, we just want to let you know that you're a sickle cell trait carrier. I'm like, hold on. I have a cousin with sickle cell disease. Is it He's like, no, it's not sickle cell disease. You just have one copy. Just make sure you don't mate with another person because you can have a child with sickle cell disease. And I'm like, oh, my childbearing days are done. Yo, I'm done having kids. I got 3 daughters already. So that's not happening. So I was 29 years old, in one ear, out the other. They said it was nothing to worry about. So I didn't worry about it and just went on with my career. And here it is in 2010, I'm talking to my fellow officer, and he reminds me that I have this inherited gene. And so I go back in and I get that paperwork, and sure enough, it says positive sickle cell trait. So I go home and I do some research, and I find that military personnel, athletes, people scuba diving, people mountain climbing in Denver, hanging out, have died and had heart attacks from sickle cell trait exertion, which is a condition. And I'm like, wait a minute. So I take all that information to my rheumatologist and I'm like, look, I need you to look at this paperwork because I think this is what happened to me in 2006. And this is 2010. And so she does some more blood work, of course. And sure enough, positive sickle cell trait test comes back. She tells me that 40% of my red blood cells are the S gene. And that sure enough, that the rhabdo experience with my trait is a risk factor for people with sickle cell trait, and it made sense of what the military had started the medical board process for. So when I turned all that paperwork in, that just solidified with my arthritis issues and my joint pain issues, and then having that status, I was no longer deployable. So it was like they were done with me. And the best way that I could describe that is to be treated like a wet towel. How you just take a wet towel and you just throw it away and just throw it outside. That's kind of how my experience was on my transition out of the service. And that just made it even worse because it was like, I've given y'all all this time and then you're gonna just like treat me. And plus I'm not ready to get out. Like if I would have made E8, I would have been like retiring this year. It would have been 30 something years. And so just all that. And then going to my mental health appointment this last time, another person was there. My regular guy was out. He was on leave. So another guy came in. He read my chart. He says, what are you going to do when you retire? I says, well, I have an idea about a sports brand called What's the Count? Maybe I'll just sell some t-shirts and sit on the dock of the bay and watch the tides roll away and whistle. That was my retirement song. And so he's like, let me show you something. And he opened up this book that he had wrote for a handbook for student athletes that are going from high school to college and what they should look for college. And so he had 2 paragraphs of sickle cell trait exertion with college athletes. And so I'm reading this and I'm crying like, you know what happened to me? He's like, yeah. He's like, it happens a lot. It either gets misdiagnosed or the people that die have heart attacks and they don't, and the families don't even know. And I'm like, you gotta be kidding me. And so he's like, you can become an advocate. I'm like, what's an advocate? He says, you can actually use your sports brand and sell your hats and t-shirts, and that could actually fund your program, and you could travel and speak and educate parents and coaches and athletes. And I kid you not, in the midst of that depression, it was like the cartoon light bulb came over my head, and I was like, oh my goodness. So I went home, and instead of spending 3 or 4 o'clock in the morning, worrying about my life, I started doing more research on sickle cell trait and the rhabdo. And I was like, I think I know what I'm going to do. And so I found my voice in that gene. And so I started developing a brochure and things like that. I found the sickle cell community that I didn't know even existed. There's, millions of people globally, like 300 million people globally have sickle cell trait. And United States is about 4 million, they say. So I found this whole other community that I felt that if I could defend this country, then maybe I have a voice and use my time to, tell my story. But it was still challenging, still depressed, still kind of dealing with that. And a friend of mine, she worked for Panda Express as a manager, and she was in this education that he sends his employees to called Landmark Education. And so I was like, she was like, hey, you know what? You should take these classes. And she was trying to get me to take the courses. And I'm like, nah, I'm not interested. And probably about the 3rd time, she was like, well, all walks of life take these courses. You might meet somebody who might want to help you with your sports brand. So she lured me in on the marketing. And she was like, you can meet, you meet all these different people, all walks of life, take these courses, and they could help you. And so I'm like, you know what? All right, I gave in. I said, all right. So she says, don't worry about it. Me and my friends are gonna pay for all of it. You just have to pick the dates. So I said, okay. So January 2011, I take the landmark form, and that Friday, I'm in that chair, and the coach, it's about 160 people in the room and one coach, and he starts to go through the landmark distinctions. And the biggest one that transformed my life was the conversation about the vicious circle. And we know we talk about the vicious circle, but in the context of what that education shares, is literally what happens and then what you make it mean. And as soon as you collapse those two worlds, everything that starts to happen will, because my life is over. And so as I'm sitting there and I'm listening to him give the directions of how to search in your own life to see where this conversation shows up, it was like right in my face, like the day I sat at my desk at work and I made that decision that my life was over. And so when I saw that show up, I'm like, wait a minute. And I did the distinction, and I peeled it off. And sure enough, what happened was the military said that I was going to get a medical board. What I made it mean was my life was over. And by those collapsing those two worlds together, it was that cycle, that circle of my marriage failed, everything that started happening to me, well, because my life is over. And that was the spiral that was triggered my depression. And so when I saw that if I made that up and it was negative, if I can make up my life is over, then what can I put in place that would give me a new life to live for? And I saw the sickle cell trait advocate. And so I implemented that into my conversation from that moment on of that course. And I started to develop that program and becoming a speaker, and started going to schools and health fairs and wherever I could get in to share this story about my sickle cell trait. It was like another identity switch from the uniform to the advocate. And it was like, I got something to live for. And so I still have to manage it, but it's now when I look at it from the full spectrum, I have a conversation now. So do I really want to take my life? Like, I have 3 daughters and a grandson now. Like, do I really want to take my life? And so now I have to mentally gauge all of it and filter it out and remember that, we're born for a purpose. And so going through all that, and then seeing how I was in my depression, and then looking back at my community of veterans, like, we're not different. And I've had soldiers commit suicide. And so it's like, you know what? How can I use my voice, okay, with sickle cell, but then I also experienced depression and anxiety, and learning about what that looks like. And so for me, if we understand depression and anxiety, depression is the past and anxiety is the future. And so I learned that the anxiety comes from the future of uncertainty. So I was living so far out in the future of my retirement that it was causing anxiety in my present state. And so I heard the mental health providers tell me, you have to scale your life back. And I'm like, no, I'm not scaling my life back. Like, no. But later on, I understood what he was saying. And so what I started doing for my anxiety was I started living 2 days out. If it was Monday, I lived till Wednesday. And I look in Monday and like, look, I have enough food, I have enough money, I have enough gas, like I have everything I need today. So why worry about next year? Why worry about 6 months from now? Okay, why worry about 3 months from now? Why worry about 2 months? And so the further I reeled it in, the more calmness that I began to live, because I have everything I need today. So, and then my mom, she was like, Farron, you know the Lord's Prayer, right? I'm like, yes. She says, you know that part about give us this day our daily bread? I'm like, yes. She's like, that's not just the bread that you eat. God is saying he's going to provide everything you need today. There is no future. There is no past. You plan for the future, but there's no future. It only exists in words. So my mom sharing that piece was like, okay, I get that. And so that even helped me more to just manage my philosophy about life. And now I have a theology piece that I can add for spirituality. And so I just started using all those things to manage my my anxiety. And then the depression, I had to start looking like, what was it? And one of the things I discovered was I was mad at myself. I was mad at myself for sprinting that morning. And what if I didn't sprint? My career would have been fine. So I was blaming myself for exercising and taking that test and sprinting. And so when I saw a glimpse of that, I was like, wow, well, maybe I have to forgive myself. So I had to start reminding myself that I forgive you for sprinting and everything's going to be okay. And God's got us. And so with all that, sir, it was, looking back at my veterans, it's like, okay, so now I can kind of articulate that. And there are some services that the VA provides, and it's not always all bad. Yes, it's very challenging to get help, but then it's like, if I share what I went through and how I found my way, maybe that veteran can start to look and see what resources that they could find. Because I didn't go to the VA at first. I did all of my landmark education and I paid for it out of my own pocket because it was helping me. And so when I looked at the VA services, I was like, well, I'm not necessarily a combat veteran because I was in states when I did my deployment. And so all their programs are more for, combat related and all this PTSD. But then I was like, that it didn't fit me. But then my dad passed away in 2019. And I, a friend of mine said, well, the VA has grievance classes. And I'm like, oh, really? So I'm like, I don't want to be that guy that's 10 years from now, I miss my dad. Like, I didn't want to live that life. And me and my dad had healed as well. And so I had no regrets, but it was that humanness that you miss from a person. And so I went to the VA and did the grievance classes, and they did help tremendously. Even on top of the landmark education that I've learned about being human, the VA classes did help. And then the psychologist was like, well, if you need some more work, we can work some stuff out. And I'm like, you know what? I do. Like, I want to do some more work. And so he says, well, we have the cognitive behavior classes. And I remember my sister mentioned that too, because I had so many body sensations with my anxiety and depression that my body was shut down, crippling. Like I couldn't get out of bed, during my times. And so um, he was like, we have cognitive behavior. And I'm like, okay, cool. Sign me up. And so when I took those classes for 12 weeks, man, to be able to challenge my thoughts, to be able to have these stories in my head and then be able to set them aside and, hey, is that exaggerated? Like how accurate is that thought? Right? Is that an exaggerated thought? Am I looking at all of it? And so when I started peeling those off in that class, I found another layer of peace. Like, okay, so I separated my life with my ideology, my philosophy, and my theology. And I learned that from Dr. Miles Monroe's. That's how he teaches spirit in his spiritual principles. And so I looked at my ideology as my thinking of the thought before the thought. The body keeps the score. So your body can react even before you have the thought of a traumatic experience. And so when I started looking at that, and I'm like, okay, so I got the VA classes that's kind of helping me with my thought process. And then I had to challenge my philosophy from the first 40 years. Like our parents, they do great, and they protect us and they teach us stuff. But then at some point in life, you grow up, you're like, hey, some of that stuff doesn't work for me. And so now you got to look at what do I believe in? And so the landmark education helped me develop a new philosophy. And the stuff that I learned from them, I looked at my life and then I challenged it to get up against what I learned. And a lot of stuff I learned about life was from movies and TVs and books and other people's life experiences, conversations. And it was like, you know what? That doesn't work for me. And so I applied the landmark education as a philosophy. And that brought me back to my spirituality. And so I don't do religion or religious conversations. It's more of a relationship. So that's what has helped me maintain my sanity and my identity. And so when I looked at more of what caused my depression was when I went from E4 to E5 and I became Sergeant Dozier, right? And was not specialist, now it's sergeant. And so that whole ego and that whole, it's a good feeling when you get that, become an NCO. And so, but I saw that when that career was taken away, so was my identity. And so when I looked at that for other veterans, like that's kind of what happens. And so I started interviewing and talking to veterans to stay connected. And I met guys that were homeless before they joined the service, did their tour, go home, and they're going back to homelessness because that's what they're accustomed, that's what their survival skills outside of the service brought them. And so that just allowed me to be able to not even tell them what it was, but just to listen and be the space where, hey, look, and how I could relate to them. And I learned that for me, trying to understand people sometimes is not effective because you're throwing away the parts of their listening, your listening that you don't connect to. And so what I started doing, I started listening to how I could relate to people. And if I listen to relatedness, then I might have a story or a version of that story like yours. And then you could see some insights. And now we're dialoguing and now, well, I don't understand you, man. So I don't know what to tell you. No, now I can, oh, but that's what that is. Oh man, well, mine looks like this. Well, yeah, maybe you could start there. And so that was what really helped me connect with veterans and my service. And so I do recommend that, if you're a service member, that you go to the VA. I mean, you got to fight those systems. Sometimes it feels like they want to turn you away so you don't get any help, but you have to be persistent. You earn those benefits. You earn those, the funding that you can get for your injuries and stuff. And the women also, a lot of women don't think that they're considered veterans because of their time in service. And I had friends that she did 2 tours in Iraq and she would not go to the VA. I'm like, you earned that. Like you are having problems, like your back hurt, your leg hurt, and you grinding your teeth in your sleep and all that. Like, but she didn't want to go because she didn't want to be harassed by the old timers when they see a woman veteran come through those walls, those doors. She's like, I don't even want to be bothered. But I shared with her how important it was. And luckily she went and she gets a check for the rest of her life for her military service. So I partnered with another organization called Vet Hunters, and they did search and rescue for homeless veterans. So when I transitioned out of the service, I joined them. And to be able to go not just downtown LA, but like off the freeway, like off in the washes where the camps are, and to go out there and see, how they're living. And a great portion of those are veterans because they don't want nothing to do with the system or the government. And then we go out there and build relationships over time and then bring services to them. And that's priceless. And then you realize that my life maybe ain't that bad because I have my house and stuff, and so it just gives you another perspective. But then it also allows you to look at like the objectification that we're trained. And even though it's done as youth, like our parents teach us to objectify people, to make sure you don't hang around these kind of people, look out for this kind of person. So we're taught to objectify people to survival skills. But I think out of context, that can also be a negative in our life because now we label people. And as we're labeled a veteran, that could desensitize that person. Well, it's not like you're not a human, you're a veteran. And you lose sight of that. So when we talk about veterans and homeless, ness and things like that, if you don't catch yourself, you might not remember that that's a person first. And that person has family members and maybe children. And we would find people who knew where their families were. They knew where their children were, but they didn't want to be a burden on their family. And they're like, no, I don't want to. But then we found one guy and he was dying. Like we found him, he was dying on the streets. And he knew where his daughter was. He knew where they lived back east. And so we did what we could to connect him with his family before he passed. And that gave us that satisfaction of helping and it connected him back to his family before he passed. So those are the kind of things that as veterans, the biggest thing right now for me is what objectification looks like and the labeling that it does. And with the military, they do it great. They take us as 17, 18, 19-year-old malleable minds, and they train us and they teach us to objectify that human being to a terrorist. And now that allows us to, okay, click, well, that's a terrorist. It's not a person, it's a terrorist. So now you train to kill terrorists, but one day that brain is going to remember, oh man, that was a man. And what if he had kids and a wife? Like, oh, I didn't kill a terrorist, I killed another person. And then you got to live with that. And there's nothing that turns that off. And so understanding objectification has helped me even relate, because it's a human being conversation, not just a combat veteran conversation. These are real life human being experiences. And so it just allows me to have a dialogue and then support them in different resources and things like that. So the suicide piece is if if you have a plan, the willingness to want to commit suicide and wanting to give up, if you can just disconnect one of those like I did and find the willingness to like I said, now I can advocate for this community. So it's the same almost satisfaction of serving this country, but now I'm serving a community of people. And that gives me the willingness to not drive my car off the freeway. And so understanding that and being able to articulate that, and then being able to have listening skills to share with other veterans, I mean, it's been nothing but a beautiful, difficult, but beautiful transition. And I've been now retired 7 years. So,
That's a story, man. Thank you for sharing.
yeah.
Is there a book out for that?
So, I had had this idea in the back of my mind, um, probably 20, probably like 2012. And I thought about writing a book and making it a chronicles, but I was kind of discouraged because like I don't have nothing to write about, like 100-page book. Like I don't have nothing for I don't have no, I don't want to be no author, right? And so I was actually last year, no, 2019. Yeah, 2019, I did a career day for the second time at an elementary school here in my area. And so the counselor introduced me to this gentleman who was a male nurse. And she's like, you two need to meet. And so we talked, and he was like, yeah, I had this car crash. He was up in Mulholland Drive somewhere, and him and his friends were driving, two cars, and the turn came, and the car in front made the turn, but the car he was in went off the cliff. And so he talks about the experience of crashing, going down the cliff, and he survived. And he's like, you know what? I survived that for a reason. So now I'm like looking for my purpose. And so he's like, I wrote this inspirational read. I'm like, what's an inspirational read? He's like, oh, it's like about 17 pages. And it's just my story about that part of my life that I want people to share. And I'll make it, I'll give it away, or I might sell it. And I'm like, wait a minute, you mean I could write something that's like 10 pages? Like I could write something like that? So it made me think about my chronicles that I was wanting to put together. And with the landmark education, what I discovered in that curriculum was not just the new life as a veteran, life after military, I call it, but I also healed my relationship with my parents. I healed some things about myself at 40 years old that when I look back was like, that's why I look at life like that. Like, so when I learned that we make decisions about who we are very young as children, and that brain puts that wedge there, and you become, well, I'm not good enough, I'm not worth it. Those I'm nots that when your mouth is not moving, that voice in your head is saying like, you don't want to do that. You ain't good enough for that. It's not. And so I had that voice was like it was me. And in that education, I realized, no, that's not you. That's your subconscious mind. That's what protects you, keeps you safe, but that's not who you are. And that education peeled off some layers, man, that at 35 years, I love my dad. I loved, but he got on my nerve, right? And that upset kept me from connecting to him like purely. And for 35 years, because of a 5-year-old decision that my dad left, and he didn't love me, and that's why he left. But he wasn't even there. So whoever was in the room that told me that, oh, your dad left, I was mad at him, and he wasn't even there. Like, and then what was a 5-year-old know about being an adult? So I have no idea why he left, and all these different stories that my mind had created from 5 years old to 40, which was 35 years. And I saw in that course that weekend that I made that up. So not only did I make up that my life was over, but I had also made up things about my parents that when I looked at it, the empirical truth was, that might not be the truth. And when I saw that, I had to let it go. I had to not, I could no longer hold that against my dad. And I called my dad and I apologized to him. And I said, Dad, I love you. Thank you for teaching me how to tie my shoe. Thank you for teaching me to how to walk. Thank you for like everything, the coloring books. Like, thank you for all the things that you did for me. I really appreciate you. I love you. But I also made up a story about you that wasn't true. And I need to tell you. And I told my dad what I could remember about that story. And you know what my dad said? I love you, son. I just want to spend time with my son. And I was like, wow, this dude really did love me all these years. And so at that moment, all the stuff in my mind that I thought was a negative, he got on my nerve. I made a commitment that day that who I'm going to be with you, Dad, is acknowledgement and gratitude and joy instead of being upset, angry, and pissed off. So you can see what upset, angry, and pissed off got me for 35 years. I don't want that. I want acknowledgement, gratitude, and joy because that's what I see is missing. It's not that our relationship was right or wrong or good or bad, but it was who I was being with my dad that didn't allow him to show up any other way except upset, angry, and pissed off. And when I saw that and I practiced being that with my dad, even though my body sensations were boiling up and pissed off when he would say something to me about what I should do with my life, I caught myself and says, thanks, Dad. I appreciate that. Now tell me, why do you think like that? What makes you think that that would be the best suggestion for my life? And you know what? Sometimes he didn't even have an answer. Sometimes his answer was, I just love you, son, and I just want you to have a good life. And so I saw the transformation in our relationship like right in front of my face. And he never changed. He was the same person all those years, but how I viewed him is what transformed. And so when he passed away, we were gonna do this work together and do a father-son conversation. I'm in broadcasting too, so we were gonna do this whole speaking and just travel and share how we healed. And he passed away. And I was like, well, I could still do that work and acknowledge him, and he still lives in this work with me. And so I wrote my first inspirational read called Life of a 5-Year-Old, The Perception of My Father. And so I've created that just beginning of this year. I printed up a couple of them. I got a PDF available, and it's not that I'm selling books because I don't need that. Like God blessed me with my retirement. And so I want to use that inspirational read to gather sons and fathers and just have this conversation and be that space for them to look in their own life and see what those, some people call them strains. What's the strain on the relationship, right? It's not always traumatic. And so it's like, what is the strain or what's the wedge that keeps you from that pure love from your parent, from your father? And so that's the first one. And so I have some plans to create some type of engagement where I could facilitate that and have sons. I'm gonna start off with the son to fathers, because I don't have a son, but I have daughters. So as a male, most of us, we should all have a father or had a father. So I'm like, if I focus on the sons, then that'll get me to have them connect back to their father. And so when we talk about it's father-son relationships, that's what we get. That's what most people talk from, father-son relationships. So I'm bringing, no, what about son to father relationship? And that's how I'm going to take my inspirational read and transform the relationship with that son to his dad. And maybe the dad may never transform, may never change, but it's not about the dad changing. It's about having that son connect to his father. And if you follow the Bible principles, that second promise in the commandments is honor your father and mother, that you may have a long life. And so that passage for me is exactly what God has shown me for my work, because you're not gonna love your father, you're not gonna love your mother. That sometimes you're not even gonna like them, but it's not even about that. It's about the spirit behind how you think about them and how you talk, what comes out of your mouth. And so if you hear people, oh yeah, my dad's cool, but he's a jerk, or he gets on my nerve, or he's, okay, so what's that? what makes you say that your father's a jerk? What makes you say that? And see what was that strain that created that wedge. And I believe by speaking to those areas, like I did, they'll find, oh, wait a minute, that's not true about my dad. Exactly. And so that's the ultimate goal for that. So I know I may have to sell some so I can replenish those books, but I'm not like a author who needs to sell books. That's not where I'm coming from. I'm coming from a place of how can I get this message out to share with other men, and that's how I found you. As to how can I get on some shows to just share this message, and those that are interested, they could contact me and read the book, or they can just contact me and talk to me. Like, God says, find something that you could do that you'll do for free. And my sickle cell trait awareness is definitely one of those. And this one is also in that same space because the military took care of me. When they medical retired me, I got my retirement check and I got my VA check. And so I still deal with physical injuries. I still deal with my mental health. This work helps me not focus on myself and focus on that give back. So as veterans, we're looking for what's next. And I want to be the space. And I work with a couple a Korean era veteran as well, Caldwell Williams. He has a curriculum that he's been using for 50 plus years, back when there was no group counseling in schools. And so he has a curriculum, and he's 87 years, about to be 87 years old this year. And he's like, look, I'm on borrowed time. I want to pass all this knowledge to you veterans and athletes so you guys can take this education, and all I want in return is give a percentage to my trust fund for my grandkids. So he's literally downloading his knowledge and curriculum into us as we learn it and practice it so that we can take it to veterans. And I mentioned athletes because athletes are no different than veterans. We grew up in the same neighborhood. Some go to play sports, some go to the military. But if you've been playing sports since you were 5 years old, 8 years old, and you've been that student athlete, and you may not make it to, maybe some make it to high school to college. But what about the ones that don't go to college? And that identity is now stuck in that high school football career. What are they doing? Struggling with the same identity crisis. Or you do go to college, but you don't go to the pros. So then what are you doing from your college? You're stuck. Some people get stuck in that identity. And the worst case is the NFL. And I hate to use the example of Junior Seau, who had a great, awesome career and then committed suicide because he felt that his life was over after his football career. So the identity crisis is so similar between athletes and military, and the youth look up to us. They look up to the athletes and they look up to the veterans. And so if we could be responsible for the transformation of the next generation behind us, that we can teach them these foundation skills and teach them how to, not what to think, but how to think about life. Look at the consequences. Like, these are the things that I learned at 40 and now I'm 50. And it's like, okay, we got to take care of this generation because society is not doing it. Society is kind of corrupted with their beliefs and ideas, and we're all battling each other because of I'm black, you white, and I want my reparations, and like all these things that I'm not saying is not a conversation that we shouldn't have, but I look at the passage about Moses, right? And how Moses was chosen to lead the slaves out of Israel, right? And that passage really caught my attention because Moses he had killed somebody already. He killed the guy there. Like he was on the run, and God still goes back to him and says, no, now I want you to go and free my people. And so that whole passage, when I look at it from today, and then I look at it from what the Bible, that passage, the Israelites were slaves 430 years and they didn't know God. And here comes Moses saying, hey, I'm going to deliver you so you can make it to the promised land. And that 40-year walk was really only 40 days. If they would have really took that walk from that moment, it was like a 40-day walk, but they walked for 40 years. Why? Because they were delivered to the wilderness, but they still had the mindset of being slaves in Egypt. And so I've been looking at that, man, and I'm like, how does that relate to today? And I'm like, you know what, that does, because we still, even as a Black community, some families still focus on the slavery days, and it's not a positive context. It's not a positive context. But what if we looked at it from the perspective of, okay, that's what happened, and acknowledge our ancestors, and acknowledge them for the strength. Like, we're their prayers right now, that they prayed whatever that we was doing, picking cotton or whatever that was, and praying for their seed to be free. Guess what? If you look at it, you are free. But should I say delivered? Because the mindset still thinks about being what happened to the ancestors in slavery. And so today's conversation and that Bible passage, I really been looking at how I could even share that as a conversation to bring some balance to Moses, passed that to Joshua, and Joshua is the one that led them to the promise. Even Moses didn't go to the promised land because he still had the mindset of being in Egypt. And so God was like, no. So God allowed the next generation for 40 years be born, and they weren't born in slavery. They were born, but weren't born in Egypt as slaves. So they didn't have the memories of being slaves. Like we don't have the memories of what it was actually like. We talk about what happened, but none of us was slaves. And so that's the difference. It's the mindset. So we delivered, but our minds are not free because we're still arguing and we're still fighting with ourselves about what happened to our ancestors. And I think it's just a different perspective, a different interpretation, and a different perception. And if we really have that dialogue, I think there could be a space for whatever this thing we want in life called social justice. And lastly, with that, one of the reasons why God didn't allow them to go to the promised land with the mindset of Egypt, because they were going to have to take on stuff in Canaan, the systems. So imagine having to, if they did go, they was mad about Moses, about why did you bring us out in this wilderness? And now they're mad with Moses about, I want to go back to Egypt. And then they got to go to Canaan, and then they got to fight whatever's going to happen. So it's like today. We look at the system and we blame the system, but guess what? What if we just said, the heck with the system? How do we as people come together, agree on some language, on some terms, and let's strategize so when we go to the system, they'll listen. But the system got us arguing and debating and all these different subjects, and it's not working. So what social justice means to you might not mean the same to me. What love means to you might not mean the same. So we don't even agree on the terms. Like we don't even agree on what it even would look like to have just peace in our community. And even if they do take the knee off our neck, are we going to get up and fly? No. So you still have to heal the community, even if we do change the laws and they put something in place to protect us, because there's nothing that values us. So even if they did put laws in place, you still got the mindset of, I'm going to be nervous still. Like you still got that. So how do you heal that so you can have that freedom? And we can do that with the next generation. So maybe in 40 years, I'll be 90, my grandson will be 42. And if I do my part, he won't have to worry about that. He won't have to live in that kind of thought process. So the books, the inspirational reads are the opening to these kind of conversations. And I'm grateful. I'm grateful to be able to share what these reads look like. The next one is with my mom. So I wrote The Life of an 8-year-old. I have The Life of a 14. So there's just the decisions that I discovered that I made about myself that was my trap. And so I want to share those stories or testimonies and help people discover, what's in their own way.
Indeed, brother. Thank you. Thank you for sharing your story.
Yeah.
How can people get in contact with you and get access to your literature that can definitely change the mind states of our youth?
Real simple, farrond.com. That site has everything about what I'm up to. It has the sickle cell trait. It has the veteran information. It has the book, the inspirational read. I own a ABA basketball team, so I'm using that platform to reach the community. Sometimes I forget it's an entertainment company because I have so much community outreach. So we're going to build that as a program to reach the athletes, because we want to bring in athletes to help us teach this curriculum, again, because the youth look up to them. And so with the ABA being such a community-based kind of a team, they're accessible, not like LeBron James. You can't get to LeBron James, but the ABA players, we're going to have community work, and they become mentors with this program as well. So they'll be right engaged in the schools and the high schools and at the events. So farrond.com will take you to everything that I'm up to.
All right, all right. Any last words before we depart?
No, I just want to acknowledge you, man. Thank you for having this platform, and again for your service as well. I don't discount your years at all, man. It's less than 2% of the population serving the military, and so that's a very small percentage, and we give up a lot. I don't like to use the word sacrifice anymore, because if you're doing what you're supposed to do in life, then you're not sacrificing, this to do this, but at a young age, we didn't really know, we're looking for that outlet. And but what you gave up is just as valuable as my years. And so that brotherhood, I think it doesn't matter what age we are, what color. Like when you meet another veteran, it's like instant family. And then that's the brotherhood that a lot of us miss, is that camaraderie. Even though we know we don't get along with all the different branches at times, but that camaraderie is still that connector, the relatedness. So I'm very appreciative of your platform and what you do for our community as well.
Indeed, indeed. Thank you, thank you. I look forward to connecting with you again one day.
Thank you.